There is a photograph taken backstage in 1973 of a 9-year-old Michael Jackson standing beside his father. Joe Jackson is dressed sharp, his hand near his son's shoulder, and if you don't know the story, you'd call it a tender moment. A proud dad, a rising star. But Michael Jackson would spend the next 36 years of his life trying to explain what that photograph doesn't show you. Because behind the arm around the shoulder was a man who once told his son, point blank, "You will not call me Daddy. You will call me Joseph." Because in front of that same warmth was a belt, held in the hand of a father sitting in a folding chair, watching rehearsal, waiting for a missed step. Because decades later, one of the most famous men who ever lived would tell Oprah Winfrey, in front of 90 million people, that just seeing his own father walk into a room could make him physically sick. And yet, that same man, standing at a podium at Oxford University in the year 2001, would look out at a room full of strangers and say something that stunned even people who thought they understood Michael Jackson completely. He said he wanted to forgive his father, not because Joe Jackson had earned it, not because the past had been erased, but because, in Michael's words, he wanted a father, and this was the only one he had. This is the story of Michael Jackson and Joe Jackson. It is not a story about a monster and his victim, as convenient as that framing might be. It's a story about fear and gratitude tangled into the same relationship, about a man who built an empire off his son's talent and never once said he was sorry for how he did it, and about a son who spent his life oscillating between resentment and grace, until, near the end, he chose grace. Stay with us, because the real story of this father and son is far more complicated and far more human than the headlines ever let it be. To understand Joe Jackson, you have to understand where he came from, and it wasn't anywhere close to a stage. Joseph Walter Jackson was born in 1928 in rural Arkansas, in a black family scraping by in the Jim Crow South. His parents split when he was a teenager, and he bounced between his mother in East Chicago, Indiana, and his father in Oakland, California, before eventually settling into a life that offered him almost none of the opportunities he would later demand his own children seize. He worked as a crane operator at a steel mill in Gary, Indiana. He played guitar in an R&B group called the Falcons on the side, chasing a music career that never quite took off, and by most accounts, that failure stayed with him. He married Katherine in 1949, and together they built a family in a 2-bedroom house in Gary, a house that would eventually hold 10 children. Money was tight. Opportunities for a black family in industrial Indiana in the 1950s and 60s were tighter still. And Joe Jackson looked at his sons, particularly the 2 youngest boys who could really sing, Marlon and Michael, alongside their older brothers Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine, and he saw something most fathers in his position never got the chance to see, a way out. What he did with that vision built one of the most successful family acts in the history of American music. What it cost his children is the other half of the story, and Michael Jackson spent the rest of his life trying to hold both halves at once. The rehearsals in that small Gary house have become legend, and not the flattering kind. Joe Jackson ran them like a drill sergeant. According to accounts from multiple Jackson family members over the years, he would sit and watch his sons practice their harmonies and choreography, and if a step was out of place, if a note was flat, the punishment was immediate and physical. A belt. A switch, whatever was within reach. Joe himself never fully denied this, even though he spent years trying to soften the language around it. In a 2003 BBC interview conducted by Louis Theroux, when Joe was asked directly about the beatings his son had described, he pushed back on the word beating itself, insisting he had whipped his children with a switch and a belt, but drawing a line, in his mind, between that and what he considered real abuse. When the interviewer brought up Michael's claim that seeing his father made him physically ill from fear, Joe's response was chilling in its coldness. He regurgitates all the way to the bank. That line tells you almost everything you need to know about how Joe Jackson processed his son's pain. It wasn't cruelty he denied, it was that the outcome, in his mind, justified whatever it cost to get there. And the emotional distance ran just as deep as the physical discipline. Michael and his siblings were forbidden from calling their father Dad or Daddy. He insisted on Joseph. Michael would later describe, with visible pain even decades on, how badly he wanted to call his father Daddy as a small child, and how flatly that was refused. "He didn't allow us to call him Daddy," Michael said. I wanted to call him Daddy so bad. He said, I'm not Daddy, I'm Joseph to you. It's a small detail, but it captures something larger. This wasn't just strict parenting. It was a home where affection itself was rationed, where a boy's need to feel close to his father was treated as an inconvenience to be corrected. By the time Michael sat down across from Oprah Winfrey on February 10, 1993, in what would become the most watched interview special in television history, he had never spoken publicly about any of this. Not the belt. Not Joseph. None of it. And when Oprah pushed him gently on why his father disciplined him so harshly, Michael's answer wasn't angry. It was almost bewildered. I don't know if I was his golden child or whatever it was, he said. Some may call it a strict disciplinarian or whatever, but he was very strict. He was very hard. Just a look would scare you. And then came the line that would follow him for the rest of his life. There's been times when he'd come to see me, and I would get sick. I'd start to regurgitate. Watch the tape today, and you'll notice what Oprah noticed live. In the room. Michael, the biggest star on the planet, immediately tried to walk it back, turning to the camera and saying, almost pleadingly, please, don't be mad at me. A grown man, decades removed from that house in Gary, Indiana, still flinching at the thought of his father's disapproval. Oprah would later reflect that his eyes shifted every time the subject of his father came up, the body remembering what the mind had tried to file away. Here is where the story refuses to stay simple, and where anyone trying to reduce Joe Jackson to a cartoon villain runs into a problem. The results were real, and Michael knew it better than anyone. Joe Jackson's relentlessness didn't just produce trauma, it produced the Jackson 5. It produced a group of kids from a steel town who by 1969 had a record deal with Motown and a song, I Want You Back, that shot to #1. It produced a level of discipline, rehearsal, and stagecraft that turned 5 brothers, none of them formally trained, into one of the tightest live acts in American pop music. Without Joe's obsessive drive, without the hours of forced practice, without a father who refused to accept anything less than perfection from children who hadn't even hit puberty, there is a very real argument that none of it happens. No Jackson 5. No Michael Jackson solo career. No Thriller. Michael understood this trade-off with a clarity that surprised people who wanted him to simply hate his father. He never denied that Joe's methods worked, even as he condemned the methods themselves. Joe, for his part, never wavered from the same defense for the rest of his life. That whatever he did it to keep his children out of trouble and to give them a chance at a life he'd never had. Speaking to Oprah Winfrey decades later in 2010, Joe put it in the starkest terms possible. He said he didn't regret the beatings because it kept them out of jail and kept them right. Not an apology, not even close to one. A justification delivered without hesitation by a man in his 80s who had buried one son and watched another die at 50. That is the paradox sitting at the center of this entire relationship. The same hand that held the belt also built the ladder. And Michael Jackson, arguably more than any of his siblings, spent his adult life trying to reconcile gratitude for the ladder with the scars from the hand that built it. By the late 1970s, Michael was no longer a child, and he was no longer willing to let his father control every part of his professional life. In 1979, at 21 years old, Michael made a decision that would have been unthinkable in that house in Gary, Indiana. Just a decade earlier, he fired Joe Jackson as his manager. It wasn't a screaming match. By most accounts, it was quiet, almost bureaucratic, the kind of ending that somehow feels more painful than a dramatic blow-up. The paperwork was reportedly sent to Joe at home while Michael wasn't even present. When father and son finally did sit down to talk about it, Michael didn't come alone. According to J. Randy Taraborelli's 1991 biography of the singer, Michael brought an advisor with him, unwilling to be in a room alone with his own father to deliver news this significant. Joe, hurt, apparently asked him directly, "The fact you can't even talk to me unless you have this guy here, it hurts me, Michael. Do you know how it makes me feel?" It's a rare moment of Joe Jackson sounding less like a manager and more like a father who'd lost his son's trust, whether he understood why or not. The timing wasn't a coincidence. 1979 was the year Michael released Off the Wall, the album that announced him as a solo force separate from his brothers and separate from his father's management. Within 4 years, all of his brothers would follow his lead, each of them eventually cutting Joe loose professionally as well. Marlon, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, and Randy all moving on by 1983. Joe Jackson had built 5 careers and then watched, one by one, as each of the men he'd built them for walked away from him professionally. He would later say, publicly, that Joe loved being their manager, loved the Jackson 5 more than almost anything, and that losing that role, even while his son's fame kept climbing without him, wounded him in ways he rarely admitted out loud. For Michael, firing his father wasn't really about business strategy. It was the first time he had ever been in a position of power over Joe Jackson in his entire life, and he used it. It was, in its own way, the most significant act of self-protection Michael Jackson ever took, separating his career, the one thing his father had always controlled, from the man himself. You'd think that firing Joe as manager would have closed the book. It didn't. The fear Michael described to Oprah in 1993 wasn't a childhood memory he'd outgrown. It was still alive in him as an adult, as a global icon, as a father himself. That's what made his 1993 admission so jarring to people who watched it live. This wasn't a man recounting old scars from a safe distance. This was a 40-something superstar describing a physical reaction that could still be triggered by his own father's presence. That fear shows up again and again across Michael's life, in smaller and larger ways. Biographers and family members alike have described a man who, even at the height of his fame, would go quiet or visibly tense whenever Joe entered a room. It's part of why the moment on Oprah landed the way it did. Audiences weren't hearing a resolved grievance. They were watching someone still inside it. And Joe never gave him an easy off-ramp. He spent years publicly denying the extent of the abuse, pushing back on the word beating the way he did with Lou Theroux, framing everything as tough love that had simply worked. He never issued anything resembling the apology his son may have needed to hear. Whatever peace Michael eventually found with his father, it wasn't handed to him. He had to build it himself, largely without Joe's help. Which brings us to March of 2001 and one of the most revealing speeches Michael Jackson ever gave. Not about music, not about fame, but about his father. Invited to speak at the Oxford Union as part of his Heal the Kids initiative, Michael stood in front of an audience of students and delivered something closer to a confession than a lecture. "You probably weren't surprised to hear that I did not have an idyllic childhood," he told them. "The strain and tension that exists in my relationship with my own father is well documented." He described Joe as a tough man who pushed my brothers and me hard from the earliest age to be the best performers we could be. He talked about a father who had great difficulty showing affection, who never really told me he loved me, and who, even after a great performance, could only manage to call it a good show, nothing more. But the speech didn't stop at grievance. It turned, deliberately, toward release. "I want to forgive my father and to stop judging him," Michael said. "I want to forgive my father because I want a father, and this is the only one that I've got. I want the weight of my past lifted from my shoulders, and I want to be free to step into a new relationship with my father, for the rest of my life, unhindered by the goblins of the past." That last phrase, the goblins of the past, is about as precise a description of trauma as you'll hear from anyone who isn't a therapist. Michael wasn't pretending the abuse hadn't happened. He was naming it, specifically, as something haunting him, and then choosing, publicly and deliberately, to stop letting it run his life. What makes the Oxford speech remarkable is the reasoning behind it. Michael didn't frame forgiveness as something Joe deserved. He framed it as something he needed for himself, and, tellingly, as something rooted in an understanding of where his father came from. Michael had come to see Joe's harshness as inseparable from the world that shaped him, a black man born in the Jim Crow South, watching his own dreams of a music career collapse, determined that his children would not suffer the same dead ends he had. It didn't excuse the belt, but it explained it. And for Michael, that explanation became a bridge he needed to walk across. If Oxford was where Michael announced his intention to forgive, it was fatherhood itself that seemed to cement it. Michael had his first child, Prince, in 1997, followed by Paris in 1998, and Prince Michael II, known as Biggie, in 2002. According to those close to him, becoming a parent fundamentally shifted how he understood Joe. Biographer J. Randy Taraborelli, who knew Michael for decades, has spoken about this shift directly. It was when he had his own kids, and he realized that there was nothing that he wouldn't do for his kids, Taraborelli explained. There were no obstacles that he would not overcome if it meant protecting his children. And once he realized that about himself, that's when he really came to understand his father. It's a striking idea that Michael's empathy for Joe didn't come from forgetting what Joe had done, but from recognizing, in himself, the same desperate protectiveness that had driven his father in the first place, even if it had expressed itself in devastating ways. That doesn't mean Michael became his father. Quite the opposite. He was explicit that he intended to raise his own children in direct opposition to how he'd been raised. To this day, I won't lay a finger on my children, he said. I don't want them to ever feel that way about me. That line matters. Michael's forgiveness of Joe was never an endorsement of Joe's methods. It was a conscious decision to release the anger while rejecting the behavior that caused it, to break the cycle rather than excuse it. By the time the 2003 documentary Living with Michael Jackson aired, Michael was saying on camera that he totally forgave his father for everything that had happened between them. It wasn't a single dramatic moment, it was a position he'd arrived at gradually, through Oxford, through fatherhood, through years of processing what few public figures are ever forced to process in front of an audience. Taraborelli has since said that in his private conversations with Michael, the singer put it even more plainly, Michael told me, I totally forgive him. As flawed as Joe was, Michael had come to believe he'd done what he did, mistaken as much of it was, for what he thought were the right reasons. It's worth sitting, for a moment, on what Joe Jackson never gave his son in return. Even as Michael was publicly working through forgiveness, at Oxford, in documentaries and interviews, Joe never offered anything resembling an apology. He continued, for the rest of his life, to frame his parenting as vindicated by the results. He continued to bristle at the word abuse. Even in his final years, in interviews well into his 80s, he held the line. It kept them out of jail. It kept them right. There's something almost unbearably one-sided about that dynamic when you look at it directly. A son doing the emotional labor of understanding, contextualizing, and ultimately forgiving a father who never once expressed regret for the specific harm he caused. Whatever closeness Michael and Joe found later in life, it existed because Michael built it, not because Joe met him halfway. And yet, Joe was there. At award shows, at family gatherings, present in Michael's adult life in a way that suggests the relationship, however damaged, was never fully severed. Michael kept his father in his life. He didn't have to. Plenty of people in his position would have cut ties permanently and never looked back. Michael chose ongoing contact, chose an actual relationship, even without ever getting the apology that might have made it easier. No account of this relationship is complete without acknowledging the person standing between Michael and Joe for most of it, Katherine Jackson. If Joe was the architect of the family's discipline, Katherine was, by nearly every family account, the counterweight, the parent Michael and his siblings could run to, the one who softened what Joe hardened. Michael spoke about his mother with a warmth that never once wavered the way his feelings about his father did. She was, in his own words and in the words of biographers who spent time with the family, the reason the household had any tenderness in it at all. That contrast matters, because it shows that Michael's fear of Joe wasn't a fear of parents in general, it was specific to Joe, to his methods, to the emotional distance he enforced. Katherine gave Michael a working model of what a loving parent looked like, even while Joe was teaching him night after night what fear looked like. In some ways, that made Joe's failures even starker by comparison. Michael knew exactly what he was missing, because his mother was standing right there, offering it. More than 15 years after Michael's Oxford speech, and nearly 2 decades after his death, this father-son relationship is still being re-examined, most visibly in Antoine Fuqua's 2026 biopic, Michael, which places Joe's discipline and Michael's fear of him at the emotional center of the film's early acts. The casting of Jaafar Jackson, Jermaine's son and Michael's own nephew, to play his uncle added a layer of family authenticity to the production that few biopics ever get to claim, and it also reopened old wounds within the Jackson family itself, with some relatives publicly disputing how certain scenes portrayed Joe. That tension, honestly, tells you everything about why this story refuses to resolve neatly. Even now, with both Michael and Joe gone, the family is still negotiating the same question Michael spent his adult life wrestling with. How do you tell the truth about a man who caused real harm and built something remarkable, without letting either fact erase the other? The film's box office success and the renewed public conversation around it prove that audiences are still drawn to this exact tension. Not a simple villain, not a simple hero, but a father and son who never stopped complicating each other's story, right up until the end. When Michael Jackson died suddenly in June of 2009, Joe Jackson was 79 years old. He would outlive his son by 9 years, dying in 2018 after a battle with pancreatic cancer. And in the time between, he rarely stopped defending his own legacy, even as the world reassessed Michael's story again and again. What we know from people who were close to Michael in his final years is that by the time he died, the two men had reached something that at least resembled peace. Not a storybook reconciliation, not an apology, still from Joe, but a version of forgiveness that Michael had chosen deliberately, years earlier, and apparently never abandoned. Tara Borelli's account, that Michael described totally forgiving his father, reflects a man who had made his peace with the past well before his death, not a last-minute deathbed reversal. That distinction matters. This wasn't forgiveness extracted under the pressure of mortality. It was a position Michael had been building towards since that speech at Oxford in 2001, if not earlier. When Joe Jackson died 9 years later, he was buried having never publicly softened his account of his own parenting. He went to his grave standing by the belt, standing by Joseph, standing by the idea that the results justified the method. It's a strange kind of consistency, a man who never once, in 89 years, admitted he might have gotten it wrong, even after outliving the son whose fear he'd once dismissed with a joke about the bank. So what do we do with a relationship like this one? Joe Jackson gave his son a childhood defined by fear, physical punishment, and a rule against ever calling him dad. He also gave that same son the discipline, the drive, and the opportunity that turned a boy from Gary, Indiana, into the most famous entertainer who ever lived. Both of those things are true at once, and Michael Jackson spent his entire adult life refusing to pretend otherwise. He didn't excuse the belt. He didn't pretend Joseph didn't wound him. He carried the fear that made him sick decades after he had any real reason to be afraid. And he said so, on camera, in front of the whole world. But he also stood at Oxford University and told a room full of strangers that he wanted his father back. Not the father who disciplined him with a strap, but a real one, a whole one, for whatever years they had left. And by every account we have, he got closer to that than anyone might have expected, choosing forgiveness not because Joe earned it, but because Michael decided, deliberately and more than once, that carrying the anger cost him more than releasing it ever would. That's not a simple story. It's not the villain and victim narrative that fits neatly into a headline. It's something messier, and honestly, something more familiar than most of us would like to admit. A son who loved a father who hurt him, who forgave a man who never said sorry, and who spent his life trying to become the parent his own father never was, without ever fully closing the door on the man who raised him. If you've made it this far, you already understand that the real story is rarely as simple as the headlines make it sound. Subscribe to Jackson Rewind for more of the story behind the story, the legacy, the music, and the truth.